Okay, so now let's finish off the stats box by creating a bar chart. So here in Wordle, as we can see, there is a horizontal bar chart titled Guess Distribution, and this reflects how many times the user has guessed a word correctly at a given row, and for the most recent game, that row is also highlighted a different color. So let's set up a similar chart in this project. To help us set up a chart, let's use the Charts Flutter package, which gives us access to a whole lot of different charts. So in this case, we just need a bar chart. So the first step is to import the dependency. So down here in pubspec.yaml, I'll paste in our Charts Flutter dependency and run pubget. Now that we have that imported, I'll go to utils and create a new Dart file, and I'll name this calculate chart stats. I will then create a new method, set chart stats, and the purpose of this method is actually to calculate the stats every time a game is completed. To help us do that, I'll create a new variable, a list of int. I'll name this distribution, and I'll populate this with 6 zeros. So now we need to call this method every time the game is completed. Let's go to the controller, and down here where the game is completed, after we call calculate stats, let's also call set chart stats. Now we only want to call this method if the game has been won, because if the game hasn't been won, we don't need to update the chart. So here I'll write if game won. In that case, we'll calculate our chart stats by calling set chart stats. Okay, so now we call this method, we need to be able to update our distribution variable. So the other bit of information that we need to know is what was the current row that the word was guessed correctly on. So we need to have that information passed into this method. I'll create a parameter required int, and I'll name this current row. Now back in the controller, we can pass that in. So we have the variable current row in our controller and also the variable game won. So we're now calling this method when the game has been won, and also passing through the information about what was the current row the word was guessed correctly on. Okay, back here in calculate chart stats, we need to update this variable. So we can do that by using a for loop. So this will run through 6 times the amount of rows there are. Then we can write if current row is equal to I, then let's update distribution at the index of I, and we'll do that by writing ++. Okay, now current row will pass through from 1 to 6, but our list is actually from 0 to 5. So we just need to adjust that so the index matches up. So here I'll just write -1. So now if the player guesses the word on the last row, the last index of this list will be updated to 1. Okay, so we can now update the row when it's answered correctly. Now just like before, let's save that data locally to the device, so if we close the app and then reopen it, that data is not lost. To do that, let's also use our shared preferences package. So the first step there is to call the get instance method to get an instance of shared preferences. Store that in a variable we'll name prefs, and we need to await this because a future will be returned. And when we're dealing with a future, we should use the async keyword up here in the method. Now we need to save that information. So I'll write prefs.set, and now we have 5 options to choose from. We want to save a list, so the best option we have is to save a string list, because there is no list of int. Now we have our key value. Let's make a nice simple key. We'll name this chart. And now we need to pass in a value. Now we can't pass in our list of int, so we need to convert this to a list of string. Let's do that by using a for in loop. So the for in loop is similar to the for loop, but we don't need access to the index in a variable here, so we can just use this cleaner syntax. Now we should create another variable, which is a list of type string, and we'll name this distribution string. So this variable will just allow us to save in our prefs. Now we can just write distribution string and use the add function, and we can add each element we loop over. Now we can't add an int, so we'll just call toString on the element, and now we can populate our list. Once that's done, we can now pass that in here. Okay, awesome. So we are now saving this information. Now, similar to before we update our stats, we should check if any stats have been saved to the device already and retrieve those. So the job of this method is just to get any stats if they have already been saved to the device. So again, we need to use shared preferences, call getInstance, return that into a variable. I'll name prefs, use the await keyword because it's a future, and use a sync up here next to the brackets in the method. Okay, so now we need to write prefs.get, and we need to get our string list, and let's type in that key, chart from here, make sure that's spelled exactly the same, and now let's return that into a variable. I'll name that stats. Okay, so now we've returned that into this variable, and we need to do a null check because there is a chance we have not yet saved anything locally. So I'll put an else statement here. So we want this method to return a list of int. So here, let's put the return type a list of int. This could be null, so in this case we'll just return null. And if we return null, this type must be a nullable type. So I'll put a question mark here. Also, because we're using shared preferences, we're returning a future. I'll right click and return a future. Now if stats is not null, so to retrieve the information we need to return it as a list of int, but we'll be accessing it as a list of string. So firstly I'll create another local variable, a list of int. I'll name that result. Then I'll use a for in loop to loop through our stats, and then we can add each element in our stats list. Now last time we converted an int into a string by calling toString. Now we need to return back an int. So here I'll write int.pass to pass the string back into an int. And that's just because we're using shared preferences, so we just need to convert our string into ints and vice versa. So this method is basically just checking if we've already saved some data to the device and then returning that if we have. Otherwise it'll return null. So now let's use that method up here, getStats. So I'm using it before we update our stats. I'll return that in a variable, and we need to await this because it will be returning a future. Now in the event that stats has some information, so it's not null, then we can set distribution equal to stats. So essentially what's happening here is we're checking if we have stats. If we do, so it's not null, we'll set this variable equal to the value of what our stats are, and then we can update that. So if our current row is already 1, this will update to 2. Once we've done that, we'll then save that data again. And finally down here in the getStats method, I should write return result. So we return our list of int from the getStats method once we've populated it. Now we can work out our game stats. In the next video, we'll create a series list which will populate our chart.